a kind of first overwhelming impression was that, and again it was cumulative, but the sense of crisis in which we all feel, and its kind of scope. And without going into details, John Cruddas talked about the slipping of liberal democracies into culture wars, nationalism and authoritarianism, and the crises within that drift. Well, we could name some. Gaza, someone described the race for paltry amounts of food and with deaths on the way. Ballymena, more closer to home, Ballymena and the targeting of asylum seekers' homes, the torching of one home. Obviously, that comes only a year after the Southport riots, or the Southport-related riots. The kind of politics being the new politics of America first, and the riots in Los Angeles, which are kind of we're surrounded by the developing outcomes of what John described as the kind of fading of liberal democracies, or the danger that they may fade into very different kinds of societies. In that context, I was interested in what John had to say about a crisis which is particular, in a certain sense, to people in this room, which is the colonisation of the spiritual, the colonisation of the sacred by forces which are looking to essentially distort what we understand to be a Christian message. Sometimes described as cultural Christianity, but it's now a phenomenon which has such a wide and kind of deep influence in American politics. Obviously you've got Vance, who's been mentioned, but also Marco Rubio, Steve Bannon, kind of stage left or stage right, wherever you'd put him, all claiming to stand up for Catholic values. And I wondered what, these are questions, not answers, I wondered what that was about. Is it something that can be simply reduced to a socio-economic analysis and critique? In other words, were some of the things that Maria described in her talk, which was a very accurate and meticulous account of what post-1980s neoliberalism did to a sense of cohesion and community in our societies, would kind of putting that right in policy terms to do with more investment, to do with some of the things that Labour is maybe starting to do, would that be enough to address all this, or is there something that is more purely spiritual, a spiritual malaise to do with cultural individualism, the decline of, well, secularisation and so on? But as I say, that's, I'm not giving an answer, I'm kind of speculating about whether what we're dealing with is purely socio-economic. What fascinated me as the day developed was a kind of growing, I hesitate to say the word tension, maybe dialogue is a friendly, dialogue between the local and the universal, which it seemed to me was coming up more and more insistently as a theme as we went on. And it was interesting that Michael made reference to the John Lennon song, Imagine, because I remember going to interview an up-and-coming radical right politician in Italy called, what was she called? Sabrina Ceccardi, I think. Susanna Ceccardi. And she was a local mayor. She was involved with the Northern League. And she became quite a leading figure, but she was kind of parroting lines which had become very familiar with the Italian far right. And one of them was the demonisation of the song Imagine, precisely because of its, no borders, I mean, she was using it as in relation to the Northern League's anti-migrant campaigns. And she was caricaturing it as a kind of mindless universalism, I suppose. That was a caricature, but I agreed with a lot of the drift of what Michael was saying, which is that there is a danger in this discussion of the local, the tribal, the particular, the place, the home, and the outsider, the vulnerable, the migrant, the not from here. There is a danger that for progressives, both within the church and outside the church, in my kind of workplace at The Guardian, it's that they're parallel dangers. There's a danger of seeing so clearly the invidious nature of this discourse from the likes of Bannon and Vance, that one falls into a kind of mirroring defence of universalism and cosmopolitanism because it's a rearguard action, basically. But what's interesting, I think, about Fratelli Tutti is that it's precisely not a rearguard action of that kind. And I thought that some of the things that really struck me, because this kind of preoccupies me anyway, were some of the things that Francis says, focusing on the other side of that tension, so focusing on the local and the rooted. And there's a couple of quotations, very brief, that I read out, but wrote down, sorry. So at one stage he says, and this is obviously talking about another theme which is clearly a core theme of the day, encounter. He writes, "There can be no dialogue with, quotes, others without a sense of our own identity." Another quote is, "No openness between peoples without love for one's own land, one's own cultural roots." And again, another quote, but no encounter, he's implying, unless I, or whoever we're talking about, stands on firm foundations. And so that I think, is very suggestive in that it, rather than an abstract universalism, what Francis is talking about is the need to root people in their own security, socioeconomically above all, but perhaps also culturally, in order that they can dialectically almost open outwards towards others. Because the surest way that you will get a kind of cosplaying actor like Farage, to use Maria's word earlier on, the surest way they will achieve success is if that local identity and those roots, those things that Francis was referring to there, are ignored by a discourse which focuses too much on the universal. And it's not so much a balance, I think, as a dialectic. And for 40 years in that neoliberal period, globalization and its discontents were all about the local and local identity being evacuated in the name of abstract, marketized forces which kind of ruled through an economic logic which appeared unassailable, and there was a revolt against that, which has then been kind of channeled towards this current focus on immigration and the anti-migrant sentiment that we see.
About 2 minutes.
Right, okay. So local and universal, the way that developed was really interesting, I thought, and yeah, I think for Catholic progressives and secular progressives, that is the question, the tension, the thing to think about on both sides, and how the sides relate in what Francis describes as our changed era. And I think, oh no, I thought I'd done time that very well, more or less. But, so I would say, just as one suggestion of how we need to think about that relationship, local, universal, within the context of places like Ballymena, places like the riot, where the riots took place after Southport, places where reform is now ahead, which I think the top 20 most deprived areas of the country are now reform. You know, that's a real that's a real problem for progressives. And it's the starting point surely has to be a radical redistribution of status, agency, another theme that came up during the day, and wealth, because all those things have gone from those places. And I might have time for a kind of final, it's not a point, it's more an observation. We're talking about hope and absence of hope, in the context of these crises. I mean, this is an uplifting point rather than a hopeful point, maybe. But anyway, in this relationship between, Francis is kind of talking about a difference without violence. Ultimately, that's the goal, that's the aim, that's the kind of city of God almost. And I think it's really interesting. Someone mentioned polyphony earlier, and Francis mentions melody, and in a really interesting way, if I've got time to read the quote, hang on, this won't take 30 seconds if I can find it. So very quickly, and then I'll stop after the quote, but very suggestive and to think about, that's all. It says, the book of Job sees our origin in the one creator as the basis of certain common rights. Quotes, did not he who made me in the womb also make him? And did not the same one fashion us in the womb? Job 31:15. Many centuries later, Saint Irenaeus would use the image of a melody to make the same point. One who seeks the truth should not concentrate on the differences between one note and another, thinking as if each was created separately and apart from the others. Instead, he should realize that one and the same person composed the entire melody. And that idea of us as notes within a melody, and harmony is the ideal state of difference, is, as I say, suggestive and uplifting maybe rather than hopeful. Anyway, that was